The year is 401 before Christ. The world is old, but the memories are fresh. A generation has passed since the great war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that had torn the Hellenic world apart. Brother against brother, city against city. It was a war that had lasted nearly 3 decades, a lifetime for many. And it had left behind a legacy of ruin and a surplus of men who knew nothing but the craft of violence. They were farmers who had forgotten how to tend the soil, potters whose hands now only fit the grip of a spear, sons who had watched their fathers die for a cause that now felt like a distant, bitter dream. Peace had come, but it was a brittle, impoverished peace. The fields lay fallow, the treasuries were empty, and these men, the hardened survivors of 100 brutal skirmishes and sieges, were now idle. They were a dangerous commodity, masters of war with no war to fight. Across the cities of Greece, from the rocky hills of Arcadia to the sun-beaten shores of Thessaly, they wandered. They were men in their prime, their bodies etched with the scars of past battles, their eyes holding the flat, weary gaze of veterans. They carried their heavy bronze shields and iron-tipped spears not as symbols of civic duty, but as the tools of a trade. They were hoplites, the most formidable infantry the world had ever known, a walking wall of disciplined destruction. But a phalanx cannot plow a field, and a shield cannot feed a family. They were adrift in the very world they had fought to defend, their skills suddenly, cruelly, obsolete. They were for hire. It was into this world of quiet desperation and restless strength that the posters began to appear. They were not nailed to the grand columns of the Parthenon or the official notice boards of the Spartan Agora. They appeared more discreetly, in the smoky taverns where soldiers drank away their meager pay, on the weathered wooden posts of bustling port cities like Corinth and Ephesus, and whispered from man to man by recruiters with foreign accents and heavy purses. The message they carried was simple, direct, and intoxicating. It was a promise of gold, of adventure, of a purpose worthy of their skill. The posters spoke of a Persian prince, a young, ambitious satrap named Cyrus. He was, they said, a friend to the Greeks, a man of honor and immense wealth. He was gathering an army, a special force, for a short, sharp campaign. The objective was straightforward: to march into the rugged mountains of Pisidia, a wild and untamed region in southern Anatolia, and to pacify the rebellious tribes that had long been a thorn in the side of the Persian Empire. It was presented as a police action, a quick and profitable expedition. The pay was exceptional. A derrick a month more than a soldier could ever hope to earn in the fractured city-states of home. It was a wage that could rebuild a farm, pay off a family's debt, or set a man up for life. The recruiters, often grizzled Greek captains themselves, painted a vivid picture. They spoke of Cyrus the Younger as a commander unlike any other. He was not like the distant, effeminate nobles of the Persian court. He was a warrior prince, a man who trained alongside his soldiers, who could ride and shoot with the best of them. He respected Greek prowess, they claimed. He saw them not as mere mercenaries, but as partners in a noble enterprise. He needed their discipline, their courage, their unbreakable phalanx. The Pisidian tribes, they assured the recruits, were fierce, but disorganized. They were mountain bandits, not a professional army. Against the might of a Greek hoplite formation, they would break and scatter like dust in the wind. It would be a short campaign, 6 months at most. March in, crush the rebels, collect the gold, and be home before the winter storms made the Aegean impassable. For a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain, the offer was irresistible. It was a chance to escape the crushing boredom of peace, the shame of poverty. It was a chance to once again feel the comforting weight of the Aspis shield on his arm, to stand shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, to hear the rhythmic tramp of sandals on the hard earth. It was a call to do the one thing he was truly good at. And so, from all corners of the Hellenic world, they began to move. A quiet exodus of the unwanted, the unemployed, the restless. They sold what little they had, kissed their wives and children goodbye with promises of a swift and wealthy return, and made their way east. Towards the gathering point, the ancient city of Sardis, the seat of Cyrus's power in Anatolia. They came not as an army, but as individuals, trickling in one by one, their hopes and their weapons their only possessions. They were walking toward the dawn, toward the heart of the Persian Empire, believing they were marching to a small, forgotten war. They had no idea they were about to step into the pages of history, as the protagonists of one of the most harrowing and epic struggles for survival ever told. The promise was gold. The reality would be fire, ice, and a journey into hell itself. The docks of Sardis thrummed with a nervous, chaotic energy. This was not the orderly bustle of commerce, of merchants haggling over amphorae of wine or bales of silk. This was the energy of a gathering storm. Sardis, once the proud capital of the Lydian kings, now a jewel in the Persian crown, had become a magnet for the discarded martial strength of Greece. Young men, and men not so young, poured into the city, their faces a testament to the diverse and fractured world they had left behind. They arrived by ship at the nearby port of Ephesus and marched inland, their heavy gear a familiar burden on their backs. They came on foot from the Greek cities scattered along the Ionian coast, their skin already bronzed by the Anatolian sun. They were a motley congregation, a living map of the Hellenic diaspora. There were lean, hard-bitten Arcadians from the mountainous heart of the Peloponnese, men born into hardship and weaned on warfare. There were proud Thessalians, masters of the horse, though here they would fight on foot. There were Achaeans, Boeotians, and even a few Athenians and Spartans. The old animosities of the Great War now submerged beneath the shared, pragmatic pursuit of pay. Each man carried the distinctive mark of his homeland in his accent, in the crest of his helmet, or in the device painted on his shield. Yet, they were united by a common language of experience. It was the language of the shield wall, of the shouted command, of the 1,000-yard stare that sees ghosts on a peaceful horizon. In the sprawling fields outside the city walls, a vast tent city had sprung up. It was a chaotic, sprawling encampment, a temporary world built of leather, canvas, and hope. The air was thick with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the metallic temps of oil on wet. The sounds were a cacophony of a dozen Greek dialects. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer repairing a dented greave, the boisterous laughter of a dice game, and the low rhythmic chanting of a paean to some forgotten war god. Here, friendships were forged over shared wineskins and stories of past campaigns. Old rivalries were rekindled and settled with fists, only to be forgotten by morning. It was a city of soldiers, waiting. The faces of these men told 1,000 different stories, yet all converged on a single point of hope and cynicism. You could see the hope in the eyes of the younger ones, boys of 17 or 18 who had missed the Great War and now saw this as their chance to earn their first scars. To prove their manhood, they polished their bronze cuirasses until they shone like mirrors, their movements full of a restless, untested energy. They spoke loudly of the glory to come, of the riches they would send home. Their imaginations fired by the recruiters' promises. Then there were the veterans, the men in their 30s and 40s who formed the solid, grim-faced core of this burgeoning army. Their hope was a more guarded, more fragile thing, buried deep beneath layers of cynicism. They had seen too much to believe in easy glory. Their equipment was not shiny but functional, its surfaces covered in the nicks and scratches of real combat. They didn't boast, they watched. They assessed the other men, judging their strength, their discipline, their nerve. They listened to the recruiters' promises with a knowing half-smile, understanding that the truth of any campaign is never found in the promises made before the march begins. Their faces were maps of past suffering, the thin white line of a scar across a cheek, the flattened cartilage of a broken nose, the haunted look in eyes that had witnessed the fall of cities and the death of friends. They were here not for glory, but for the Darracks. They were here because this was the only life they knew, and the quiet desperation of peace was a heavier burden than any shield. They were professionals, and this was a contract. Their cynicism was a shield as vital as the bronze one they carried. a defense against the inevitable disappointments and horrors that war always brings. And as they gathered at the docks and in the fields of Sardis, a city built on the edge of two worlds, they stood as a testament to the brutal paradox of their age, men trained for a lifetime of war, now forced to sell their swords to a foreign prince, simply to find a place in a world, supposedly, at peace. The day of the review dawned clear and bright, the Anatolian sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. A palpable tension settled over the sprawling encampment, a quiet hum of anticipation replacing the usual boisterous noise. This was the day they would meet their paymaster, the man whose ambition had pulled them from their homes across the sea. This was the day they would meet Cyrus the Younger. Word had spread through the ranks. The prince would inspect his new army on the wide, flat plain outside the city. It was to be a formal review, a display of power and purpose. For the Greeks, it was a chance to show their worth, to demonstrate the disciplined lethality that Cyrus was paying so handsomely for. For Cyrus, it was a chance to awe them, to bind them to his will not just with gold, but with the sheer force of his presence. The Greek commanders, men like the stern Spartan Clearchus, a political exile with a reputation for brutal discipline, moved through the camp, their orders sharp and precise. The men fell into their formations, the chaotic assembly of individuals melting away to reveal the terrifying, beautiful geometry of the phalanx. They were arranged by contingent Arcadians next to Achaeans, each man finding his place in the long lines of the shield wall. There was a rhythmic clatter as thousands of bronze helmets were settled onto heads. The sound like a sudden, heavy hailstorm. Greaves were strapped to shins, the final pieces of their warrior's shell. Spears, 12 feet of ash, wood tipped with sharpened iron, were raised to the vertical. A dense forest of deadly points bristling against the sky. They stood in silence. A vast block of over 10,000 hoplites, flanked by their supporting peltasts, the lighter skirmishers and archers. They were a sight to behold, a living engine of war, polished and gleaming in the morning sun. The sunlight glinted off 1,000 bronze shields, each painted with the symbols of a man's home or his own personal fears and hopes. The sheer unified presence of them was breathtaking, a vision of Hellenic military might transplanted into the heart of Asia. They were an island of ordered, disciplined violence in the vast, sprawling landscape of the Persian Empire. Then, he arrived. Cyrus came not with the slow, ponderous ceremony of a typical Persian noble, swathed in silks and carried on a litter. He arrived on horseback, a magnificent charger that moved with a restless, powerful grace. He was surrounded by a small, elite bodyguard of Persian cavalry. Their armor intricately decorated, but all eyes were on the prince himself. He was young, radiating an almost electric vitality. He wore a purple tunic, a color of royalty, but it was tailored for a rider, for a man of action. He sat his horse with an easy, confident command that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He rode slowly along the front rank of the Greek phalanx, his gaze sweeping over the men. It was an intense, penetrating look. He wasn't just observing a military asset. He seemed to be looking into the eyes of each soldier, acknowledging the man behind the helmet. He missed nothing. The quality of their arms, the hardness in their expressions, the disciplined stillness with which they stood. He was accompanied by the Spartan general Clearchus, and the two men spoke in low tones. Cyrus occasionally gesturing with a gloved hand towards a particular contingent, his expression one of deep, genuine appreciation. He was a student of power, and before him stood the finest instrument of infantry power the world had to offer. The Greeks, in turn, stared back from behind the eye slits of their helmets, taking the measure of this foreign prince. They saw not the soft, decadent Oriental of their prejudices, but a man whose body was lean and hard, whose face was that of a hawk. They saw a commander who looked like he belonged on a battlefield. A quiet, grudging respect began to form, a sense of belief that this man might just be worth following into danger. This was not just a review of an army. It was a compact being sealed, an unspoken promise between a prince who needed their spears and soldiers who needed his gold. The air crackled with the immense, terrifying potential of the force now assembled on the plains of Sardis. The waiting ended as abruptly as it had begun. The orders, sharp and clear, cascaded down the chain of command. From Cyrus to his chief commanders, from the commanders to the captains of each contingent, and from the captains to the men themselves. The sprawling camp, which had been a temporary home for weeks, was dismantled with the swift, practiced efficiency of a veteran army. Tents were struck, gear was packed, and the last of the local wine was drained. A new mood settled over the men, a feeling of release, of forward momentum. The uncertainty of the waiting was over. The certainty of the march had begun. They moved, out at dawn, a river of men and metal flowing east from Sardis. The initial spectacle was one of magnificent, ordered power. The phalanx, miles long, moved with a single rhythmic pulse. The sound was a low, percussive thunder, the tramp of more than 20,000 sandals hitting the hard-packed earth in unison. The rhythmic clank of shield against sword, the creak of leather straps. It was the sound of a glacier of violence, beginning its slow, inexorable advance. The rising sun caught the forest of their upright spears, tipping each point with a spark of fire. To any observer, it would have looked like an army of demigods, an invincible force marching to a swift and certain victory. But the grandeur of the departure soon dissolved under the brutal reality of the Anatolian sun. By mid-morning, the sky was a white-hot sheet of brass, and the heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that sapped the strength and will. It beat down on their bronze helmets, turning them into ovens that cooked the men inside. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes and plastering their linen tunics to their skin. The heat radiated back up from the dusty road, a shimmering, distorting haze that made the horizon dance and quiver. There was no escape from it. It was a relentless, silent enemy that attacked every man equally. From the rawest recruit to the most hardened veteran, the dust was just as bad. Kicked up by thousands of marching feet, it rose in a thick, choking cloud that hung over the column like a funeral shroud. It coated everything in a fine, gritty film of reddish-brown earth. It worked its way into their mouths and noses, making every breath a dry, rasping effort. It settled on their sweating skin, creating a paste of grime and sweat. The men began to wrap strips of cloth over their faces, a futile gesture against an enemy that was as pervasive as the air itself. The world was reduced to the back of the man in front of you, a hazy silhouette seen through a swirling veil of dust. The official story, the one that had been repeated since the first recruiter's whisper, was still their stated purpose. They were marching to Pisidia, to the rugged mountain strongholds of a troublesome tribe. The men, as they marched, would point towards the distant, hazy mountains to the south, believing their objective lay somewhere in that wilderness. It was a plausible, believable lie. The Pisidians were notoriously rebellious, and subduing them was a legitimate military objective for a Persian satrap. This story gave the march a clear, finite purpose. It put a destination in their minds, a limit on their suffering. They were not just marching into the endless expanse of Asia. They were marching to a specific, winnable war. But as the days turned into a week, and the column pushed ever eastward, leaving the supposed target of Pisidia far behind them to the south, the first seeds of doubt began to sprout in the minds of the more thoughtful soldiers. The sun was their constant companion, a merciless god in a barren sky. The march became the new reality, a grueling, monotonous cycle of waking, walking, and collapsing into an exhausted sleep. The initial energy and excitement had long since been baked out of them, replaced by a grim, plodding endurance. They were moving deeper and deeper into the heart of a continent, and the simple story they had been told was beginning to feel thin. Like a worn-out map that no longer matched the territory beneath their feet. Asterisk, asterisk, the march ground on, an endless rhythm of dust and sun. Each day was a copy of the one before, a grueling test of physical and mental endurance. The landscape itself seemed to conspire in their growing unease. The familiar, rugged hills of the Ionian coast had long since vanished, replaced by a vast, open plain that stretched to a flat and unforgiving horizon. It was a landscape that felt alien, immense, and deeply unsettling to men raised in the close confines of Greece, where the sea or a mountain was never far from view. Here, there was only the earth and the sky, and the unnerving sense of being swallowed by an endless emptiness. They were a tiny crawling speck on a map far larger than they had ever imagined. It was in the quiet moments that the whispers began. They started not in the heat of the day's march, when survival was the only thought, but in the cool of the evenings. As the men gathered around their small campfires, nursing their aching feet and cleaning the ever-present dust from their gear, the questions started to surface. They were spoken in low, guarded tones, away from the ears of the officers loyal to Cyrus. A veteran from Arcadia, tracing a crude map in the dirt with the tip of his dagger, would point out their eastward trajectory. "Pisidia is there," he would mutter, jabbing the dagger to the south. "We passed it a week ago, so where in the name of Hades are we going?" The whispers spread like a contagion, passed from one campfire to another. The lie was beginning to fray at the edges. The march was too long, the logistics too vast, the army too powerful for a simple punitive expedition against a mountain tribe. Cyrus was spending a fortune every day just to move this force. You didn't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Men who had fought in the complex campaigns of the Peloponnesian War knew the logistics of conflict. They understood the cost, the supply lines, the sheer effort involved. And what they were doing here felt disproportionate, excessive. The scale of the operation felt wrong. The presence of the other soldiers in Cyrus's army, the non-Greek contingents, added to the suspicion. Thousands of native Persian and Anatolian troops marched with them. If the goal was simply to punish a rebellious Persian territory, why did Cyrus need this massive, expensive corps of elite Greek hoplites? His own imperial troops should have been sufficient. The Greeks were specialists, a tool for a specific, difficult job. And that job, more and more men began to suspect, was not the one they had signed up for. The whispers coalesced around a single, terrifying idea. An idea so audacious, so treasonous, that at first it was spoken only as a dark joke. The name was uttered with a mixture of awe and fear. Babylon, the heart of the Achaemenid Empire. The seat of the great king himself, Artaxerxes II, Cyrus's older brother. The whispers suggested the unthinkable, that this was not a campaign, but a coup, that they were not marching to pacify a tribe, but to commit regicide. That they, the Greek mercenaries, were the sharpened tip of a spear aimed directly at the throne of the most powerful man in the known world. This suspicion changed the very atmosphere of the camp. A subtle paranoia began to creep in. Men looked at their commanders with new eyes, wondering what they knew. They looked at Cyrus, when he rode past their column, with a mixture of fear and a new, grudging admiration for the sheer scale of his ambition. The promise of gold suddenly seemed both more real and more dangerous. The kind of wealth needed to overthrow an empire would be immense, but the risks were absolute. They were no longer soldiers on a contract. They were participants in a rebellion. Every step they took eastward was a step deeper into treason, a step further away from the sea, from home, from any hope of escape if things went wrong. The whispers had begun, and with them, the slow dawning horror of their true situation. The whispers and suspicions that had haunted the army for weeks finally met their moment of truth at the banks of a great, slow-moving river. It was the Euphrates. For the Greeks, this was more than just a geographical boundary. It was a line drawn in the soul. The rivers, the Neuther, Alpheus, the Peneus were streams compared to this immense muddy artery flowing out of a half-mythical land. It was the river of Mesopotamia, the ancient cradle of civilization and empire. To cross it was to leave the familiar world behind entirely and to step into the very heart of Asia, the domain of the great king. There was no pretending anymore. No mountain tribe lived beyond the Euphrates. There was only one destination from here, Babylon. The army halted at Thapsacus, a town on the river's western bank. The water flowed wide and deep, a formidable barrier. But the true barrier was not the river itself, but the decision it represented. Here, The lie had to end. The men gathered in anxious, angry clusters, their discipline fraying, their voices rising in open dissent. They refused to march another step. The simmering discontent had boiled over into a full-blown mutiny. They laid down their spears and shields, a silent, powerful act of defiance. They were mercenaries, not kingbreakers. They had signed on for a campaign, not a civil war. It was Clearchus, the stern Spartan general, who bore the brunt of their fury. They accused him of knowing the truth all along, of being complicit in Cyrus's deception. They saw him as the architect of their betrayal. Clearchus, a man who commanded through fear and respect in equal measure, now faced the terrifying prospect of his army turning on him. He stood before them, a solitary, unyielding figure against a sea of angry faces. He tried to reason with them, to maintain the fiction, but it was useless. The sight of the Euphrates had washed away all plausible deniability. Finally, Cyrus himself was forced to confront the crisis. He rode into the midst of the sullen, rebellious army, not with his usual entourage of guards, but almost alone, a calculated display of vulnerability and trust. He did not shout or threaten. He called the Greek leaders and the soldiers themselves to an assembly. He stood before them, and with the great river as his witness. He finally spoke the truth. His voice carried across the silent ranks. He told them of his birthright, of his belief that he, not his brother Artaxerxes, was the rightful heir to the throne of their father, Darius II. He spoke of Artaxerxes as a weak, vacillating ruler, a puppet of the court eunuchs and his manipulative mother, Queen Parysatis. He painted a picture of an empire in decline, a kingdom rotting from the head. He, Cyrus, was the one who had the strength, the vision, the will to restore the glory of Persia. He had not lied to them to betray them, he claimed, but because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud until they were here, at the threshold of the enterprise, safe from the king's spies, and then he laid it bare. The objective was not Pisidia. The objective was Babylon. The enemy was not a mountain tribe. The enemy was the army of the great king, his own brother. They were here to fight one great battle, to decide the fate of the Persian Empire. He looked into their faces, men who had been deceived and led 1,000 miles under false pretenses, and he did not apologize. Instead, he challenged them. He acknowledged their anger, but he also acknowledged their strength. He told them that he had chosen them, the Greeks, because they were the only soldiers in the world capable of achieving this impossible task. He was staking his life, his fortune, and his destiny on their courage and their spears. The truth was out, stark and terrifying, hanging in the hot still air on the banks of the Euphrates. The deception was over. Now, a choice had to be made. A heavy, profound silence followed Cyrus's confession. The truth, now laid bare, was a weight in the air, pressing down on every man. The murmurings and whispers were gone, replaced by the stark, internal calculus of survival and greed. The soldiers looked at each other, their faces grim. They looked at the wide, impassive river, and then back at the Persian prince, who had gambled everything on this single moment. They were trapped, and Cyrus knew it. To turn back now meant a 1,000-mile march through hostile territory they had just crossed under his protection. They would be leaderless, without pay, without supplies, and with the certainty of being hunted by Cyrus's forces for their desertion. To go forward was to march into the heart of an empire, to face a potentially limitless army. It was a choice between a slow, certain death on the road back, and a swift, possible death on the road ahead. But Cyrus was more than just a general. He was a master of human psychology. He understood the men who stood before him. He knew that their anger, while real, was a fire that could be quenched with the right fuel. And the fuel these men craved was gold. Having revealed the terrifying risk, he now unveiled the staggering reward. He let the silence hang just long enough for the full weight of their predicament to sink in. Then he began to speak again, his voice resonating with confidence and promise. He didn't just offer them more money, he offered them a fortune that transcended their wildest dreams. He raised his initial offer, then raised it again. He promised them a bonus that would make the accumulated pay for the entire campaign seem Like a pittance, he spoke of 5 silver minas for every manor, sum so vast it was difficult to comprehend. It was enough to make a common soldier, a wealthy man, a landowner, a lord of his own small estate back in Greece. For the captains and generals, the rewards were exponentially greater. He painted a vivid picture of the spoils of Babylon, a city whose name was synonymous with unimaginable wealth. He spoke of the treasures of the great king's camp, of the gold and silver that would be theirs for the taking after the battle was won. He made it sound not like a war, but like the greatest treasure hunt in history. His words were a potent alchemy, transforming their raw, primal fear into a different, equally powerful emotion, a virus. The anger in the ranks began to visibly dissolve, replaced by a low, excited murmur. The men started to do the math in their heads. The risk was absolute. Yes, but the reward was legendary. They were mercenaries, after all. Risk was the currency of their trade. They had sold their spears for a daric a month. Now they were being offered a king's ransom. The moral dimension of the conflict, the treason, the regicide faded into the background. This was no longer about loyalty or deception. It was a business transaction of epic proportions. Clearchus, the Spartan, seeing the tide turn, seized the moment. He stepped forward, and, in a masterful piece of political theater, pretended to be reluctant, arguing for the men's safety, but it was a performance. He allowed Cyrus to persuade him, and then he turned to the army and gave his formal, resounding assent. With their own most respected general now on board, the last pockets of resistance crumbled. A cheer went up, hesitant at first, then growing into a deafening roar of approval. The mutiny was over. The choice had been made. Rage had been masterfully transmuted into greed. With promises of wealth beyond imagination ringing in their ears, the Greek army turned its face to the east, picked up its spears, and began to ford the great river. They were marching on Babylon, having crossed the Euphrates. The army left behind the last vestiges of a world they recognized. The landscape that opened before them was a new kind of hell, an environment so alien and hostile, it felt like a punishment from the gods. This was the great Mesopotamian desert, the sun-scorched plains that stretched between the 2 rivers. The promises of Babylonian gold that had echoed so loudly at Thapsacus now seemed like a distant fever dream, drowned out by the deafening, silent reality of the march. The world was bleached of color, reduced to a palette of browns and blistering white. The ground was a hard, cracked pan of baked earth, occasionally dissolving into stretches of soft, energy-sapping sand. The horizon was a flat, featureless line that never seemed to get any closer, a tormenting mirage of distance. The only features were the occasional withered thorny bush, skeletal remains of life that had long since surrendered to the heat. The sun was no longer just a source of light and warmth. It was a malevolent entity, a merciless god that reigned from a cloudless, metallic sky. From the moment it rose to the moment it set, its assault was total and unrelenting. The heat was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating force that drained the very moisture from a man's body. The air they breathed was superheated, searing. The lungs, their bronze helmets, became instruments of torture, concentrating the sun's rays until it felt like their skulls were being cooked. Many abandoned them, wrapping their heads in strips of linen, but it offered little relief. The psychological toll was immense. The sheer, unending monotony of the landscape began to warp the mind. There were no landmarks, no sense of progress. Every day's march felt identical to the last, a soul-crushing cycle of suffering that seemed to have no end. The army, once a proud, flowing river of men, now seemed like a column of ghosts, trudging through a dead world. But the greatest enemy, the one that dominated every thought and every waking moment, was thirst. Water became the only currency that mattered. The army marched from one brackish, half-dry well to the next, and the discovery of water was a moment of sheer, primal joy that quickly descended into chaos. Discipline, the bedrock of the phalanx, dissolved at the sight of a muddy water. Men would shove and fight, desperate to scoop a helmet full of the precious, often foul-tasting liquid before it was gone. Cyrus's supply train, carried by a vast number of baggage animals, struggled to carry enough water for so many thousands of men, and the rations were meager, barely enough to wet a man's tongue. The animals suffered even more. Horses, mules, and oxen, their ribs showing starkly, collapsed in the heat, their agonized cries a terrible soundtrack to the march. Their carcasses were soon left behind, to be picked clean by vultures that circled high overhead, patient black specks in the white-hot sky. The men watched the vultures, and knew they were watching their own potential fate. Starvation became a close companion to thirst. The land offered nothing. The grain they carried was running low, and the rations were cut again and again. Men began to chew on leather straps to trick their stomachs, their bodies wasting away under their armor. The suffering was democratic. It afflicted the common soldier and the officer alike. It stripped away rank and pretension, reducing every man to a fundamental, desperate struggle for survival. The grand ambition of toppling an empire felt like a madman's fantasy here in the wasteland. The only ambition left was to take one more step, to survive one more hour under the tyranny of the sun, to find one more mouthful of water in a world that seemed determined to burn them into dust. This was the true price of their greed, the first payment on a debt that would be settled in blood. Asterisk, of course. Here is the full immersive script for the 9th section of the documentary. Full immersive script. The anabasis of the 10,000 section. 9 of 34 weeks, the 10,000 had been marching through a dead world. Their only enemies, the sun, thirst, and the gnawing emptiness in their own stomachs. The desert had been a void, a vast empty arena that was slowly grinding them down. But as they pushed deeper into Mesopotamia, drawing closer to the fertile lands surrounding Babylon, the void began to fill. The change was subtle at first, a flicker of movement on the shimmering horizon, a disturbance in the heat haze that wasn't a mirage. It was a presence. Cyrus's own scouts, elite horsemen who ranged far ahead of the main column, were the first to bring back the news. They reported tracks. Not the tracks of desert nomads or merchants, but of shod war horses, thousands of them, moving in disciplined formations. The great king was aware of their coming. The element of surprise, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. Artaxerxes was not waiting passively in Babylon. He was sending his eyes and ears out to meet them. Soon, the Greeks didn't need scouts to tell them they were being watched. They could feel it. The empty horizon now held a sinister potential. A man would look up from the trudge and see them, a small group of riders, perhaps 5 or 6, sitting motionless on their mounts on a distant ridge. They were too far away to see clearly, appearing as dark, slender silhouettes against the glaring sky. They would remain, for a time, impassive, spectral observers, their very stillness a profound psychological threat. Then, as if by some silent command, they would wheel their horses around and melt back into the heat haze from which they had emerged. These were the scouts of the great king's army. Their purpose was not to engage, but to shadow, to report, to unnerve. They were a constant, unnerving reminder to every Greek soldier that their long, unopposed march was over. The enemy was no longer an abstract concept, a final battle to be fought in some distant, imagined future. The enemy was here, now, riding alongside them, just out of reach. The effect on the morale of the Greek army was immediate and profound. The soul-crushing monotony of the desert march was replaced by a sharp, nervous tension. Every man was suddenly more alert. Heads constantly scanned the horizon. The chatter in the ranks died down, replaced by a watchful silence. The presence of the enemy scouts forced them to tighten their formations, to march in a state of constant readiness. The days of straggling and lax discipline were over. They were in hostile territory, and the enemy was breathing down their necks. At night, the sense of being watched intensified. The small flickering campfires that had once been a source of comfort now felt like beacons, advertising their position. In the vast dark expanse, sentries posted at the perimeter of the camp would strain their eyes into the oppressive blackness, imagining movement in every shadow, hearing the thunder of cavalry in every gust of wind. The Persian scouts would sometimes ride close in the darkness, their presence betrayed only by the faint whinny of a horse or the glint of moonlight on a helmet. They were ghosts, a promise of the massive spectral army that was gathering somewhere. Ahead of them, in the darkness, the long slow burn of the desert crossing was over. The fuse had been lit. Every man in the Greek column could feel the tremor of the approaching explosion. The day of reckoning arrived on a wide dusty plain near a village called Cunaxa, not 70 miles from the gates of Babylon. The morning air was thick with a tense electric anticipation. The spectral horsemen who had shadowed them for weeks had vanished, a sure sign that the main body of the enemy was near. The Greeks, alongside Cyrus's own Persian troops, formed up for battle. The culmination of their immense journey. Before them, the horizon began to darken, not with a storm cloud, but with the unbelievable scale of the great king's army. It was not an army that marched, it was a nation that moved. Hundreds of thousands of men, a vast glittering sea of infantry, cavalry, and scythed chariots, advanced towards them, kicking up a cloud of dust so vast it threatened to blot out the sun. The sheer, overwhelming number of them was a psychological weapon in itself, designed to induce terror and despair before the first arrow was even fired. The Greeks took their position on the right flank of Cyrus's line, near the bank of the Euphrates, a solid anchor to prevent them from being surrounded. They stood in the classical phalanx formation, a solid block of men, 8 ranks deep. They were a small island of disciplined bronze and iron in the face of a tidal wave. The men's knuckles were white where they gripped their spears, their mouths were dry. The rhythmic beat of the Persian war drums was a deep, guttural pulse that vibrated through the soles of their feet, a sound that seemed to mimic a terrified heartbeat. This was the moment they had marched towards for months. The moment that would decide if they returned home as rich men, or if their bones would be left to bleach under the Mesopotamian sun. Cyrus, riding his charger, his face a mask of fierce determination, gave the order. The Greek commanders bellowed the commands, and the phalanx began to move. It started as a slow, deliberate walk, the thousands of men moving as one. The Paean, the ancient Greek war hymn to the god of battle, began as a low chant in the front ranks, and swelled into a terrifying, unified roar that rolled across the plain. It was a sound of defiance, a challenge hurled at the overwhelming odds. Then, the pace quickened. The walk became a trot, and the trot became a charge. The phalanx, that unstoppable engine of destruction, lowered its forest of spears and surged forward. The ground shook under the thunder of their running feet. The Persians on the left wing opposite them, many of whom had never faced a charging hoplite formation, watched in horror as this wall of shields and death rushed towards them. The sight of it, the sound of it, the sheer, disciplined violence of it broke their nerve. Before the two lines even made contact, the Persian infantry began to waver. Their formation, so vast and imposing from a distance, proved to be brittle. They threw down their wicker shields and swords, and they fled. They simply turned and ran, a chaotic, panicked mob. The Greek phalanx didn't even have to fight. They smashed into a vacuum. They plunged into the space where the enemy's left wing had been, their advance barely slowing. They had shattered a section of the great king's army with the sheer terror of their reputation and their charge. A wave of elation swept through the Greek ranks. It was happening. The impossible was happening. They were winning. They were invincible. The battle had just begun, and it felt as if it were already over. Victory, and the immense riches that came with it, seemed not just possible, but breathtakingly, intoxicatingly, certain. For the Greek hoplites on the right flank, the battle had become a rout. They advanced through the space once occupied by the enemy. The ground littered with the discarded weapons and shields of the fleeing Persian infantry. Their own discipline, the very bedrock of their identity, held firm. They did not break ranks to pursue the scattered fugitives. Instead, the phalanx pushed forward methodically, a relentless, grinding machine of war, ensuring the enemy could not rally. The sounds of their own triumphant shouts mingled with the distant cries of the routed Persians. The taste of victory was in the air, so close they could feel it. The immense gamble seemed to have paid off in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. They had faced the army of the great king, and had broken it with their first charge. The road to Babylon, to its legendary treasures, lay open before them, but the battlefield was a vast and chaotic place, a maelstrom of dust, noise, and isolated pockets of intense, brutal combat. The Greeks, focused on their own sector, were deaf and blind to the pivotal drama unfolding in the center of the line. It was there that Cyrus, the Younger, at the head of his personal bodyguard of 600 elite Persian cavalry, had his eyes fixed on a single ultimate prize, his brother, Artaxerxes. He saw the great king in the distance, surrounded by his own immense bodyguard of royal horsemen, a glittering island of nobility in the sea of battle. For Cyrus, this was never about tactical victory or the careful deployment of troops. It was a deeply personal, primal struggle for power, a feud between brothers that could only end with the death of one. All the planning, the recruitment, the 1,000-mile march, all of it funneled down into this one singular moment of rage. Consumed by an overwhelming, reckless fury, he ignored the advice of his commanders. He ignored the state of the wider battle. He saw only his brother, the man he viewed as a usurper, and he charged. With a guttural cry of, "I see the man," Cyrus spurred his horse forward, his small contingent of cavalry surging with him. They crashed like a thunderbolt into the king's personal guard, a desperate, suicidal assault. The fighting was a chaotic, swirling melee of hacking swords and stabbing spears. For a few frantic moments, Cyrus fought like a man possessed, cutting his way through the royal guards, his eyes locked on his brother. He got close, so close he was able to hurl his javelin, wounding Artaxerxes in the chest. But the act of wounding his brother was his last. The charge had carried him deep inside the enemy's elite guard, cutting him off from the main body of his own army. He was surrounded, a single, defiant figure, in a sea of enemies. As he fought to wheel his horse around, a javelin, thrown by a minor Persian nobleman, struck him from the side, finding a gap in his armor just below the eye. The blow was mortal. He slumped from his saddle and fell to the dusty ground, the lifeblood of his ambition soaking into the Mesopotamian earth. A cry went up from the Persian center. It was not a cry of pain or fear, but of triumph. It spread from the king's guard, outwards, across the battlefield, a ripple of sound that carried a single, devastating message: Cyrus is dead. The words, spoken in Persian, were at first incomprehensible to the Greeks on the flank. But the shift in the battle's atmosphere was instantaneous and undeniable. The momentum, which had been so powerfully in their favor, suddenly, inexplicably, stalled. A strange and terrible stillness began to creep over the plain. The Greeks had won their fight, but in the center of the field, in a single, reckless moment of hatred, they had lost everything. The triumphant advance of the Greek phalanx slowed, then halted. The men stood, spears still lowered, in the midst of the captured ground, confused. The enemy before them was gone, scattered to the winds. By every measure of warfare they had ever known, they were the victors. They had held their flank, broken the enemy line, and now occupied the field. Yet, the sounds of battle from the center and the left of the line had changed. The roar of combat was fading, replaced by a rising, triumphant cheer from the great king's army. It was a sound that made no sense, a discordant note in the symphony of their victory. Slowly, uncertainly, the news began to filter across the dusty plain. It came not as a formal announcement, but as a creeping, horrifying rumor, carried by a few of Cyrus's panicked cavalrymen who had escaped the slaughter in the center. They rode wildly towards the Greek line, their faces masks of terror and despair, shouting the fatal words in broken Greek: "Cyrus has fallen. The prince is dead." The message spread through the Greek ranks like a fast-acting poison. At first, it was met with disbelief, with angry denial. How could it be? They had won. They had seen the enemy flee before them. How could their leader be dead? But, as more reports confirmed the news, the disbelief curdled into a cold, sickening dread. The elation of their victory evaporated in an instant. Replaced by a surreal and profound silence, a stillness fell over the 10,000 men. They stood motionless on the plain of Cunaxa, a forest of bronze and iron, suddenly inert. The setting sun cast their long shadows back towards the river, silent, elongated figures in a landscape of death. They looked at the vast Persian army, which was no longer fleeing but was now slowly, cautiously, regrouping in the distance. They looked at the empty space where Cyrus's command had been, and in that moment, the full, crushing weight of their situation descended upon them. They were in a state of perfect, terrible paradox. They were undefeated, yet utterly defeated. They were masters of the battlefield, yet they were slaves to circumstance. They had upheld their end of the bargain, delivering the military victory they had been paid to achieve. But the man who held the purse strings, the man whose ambition was the entire reason for their presence here, was now a corpse. Lying somewhere in the blood-soaked dust, their purpose had vanished in a single moment. They were no longer the elite spearhead of a rebellion. They were just a band of foreign mercenaries, 1,000 miles from the sea, stranded in the heart of a hostile empire, whose king they had just tried to kill. The victory they had won was now meaningless, a hollow, bitter joke. It offered them no safety, no reward, no path forward. They had won their battle, but in doing so, they had lost the war, and, it seemed, their own futures. They were victorious, and they were utterly, terrifyingly doomed. The silence of the phalanx was the silence of men contemplating their own epitaph. Written on a foreign field under a dying sun, the day after the battle was one of profound and unnerving stillness. The Greek army, having pulled back to its camp, awoke to a world that had been fundamentally altered. The adrenaline of combat was gone, leaving behind the bitter dregs of their hollow victory. They were an island of 10,000 men in an ocean of enemies. The vast army of Artaxerxes, though it had been bloodied, still held the field, a menacing presence on the horizon. The Greeks spent the morning in a state of grim readiness, expecting an attack at any moment. They stood to arms. Their phalanx formed a hedgehog of spears, daring the Persians to approach. But the attack never came. Instead, a different kind of approach was made. Late in the afternoon, a small party of horsemen was seen detaching itself from the main Persian host and riding slowly towards the Greek camp under a banner of truce. They were not warriors prepared for battle, but emissaries. At their head was a man named Tissaphernes, a powerful Persian satrap, a cunning and notoriously duplicitous nobleman who had been one of Cyrus's chief rivals. He was now the voice of the victorious king, Artaxerxes. The Greek commanders, led by the formidable Spartan Clearchus, met the delegation in the no man's land between the two armies. The air was thick with suspicion. The Greeks stood, fully armed, a silent, intimidating backdrop to the negotiations. Tissaphernes, his face a mask of courtly civility, dismounted and began to speak. His words were smooth, reasonable, and coated in a layer of magnanimity that felt dangerously thin. He began by acknowledging the Greeks' fighting prowess. The great king, he said, admired their courage and their discipline. He understood that they were not the authors of this rebellion, but merely its instruments. They were professional soldiers who had been hired for a job, and the king bore them no personal malice. Now that their employer, the traitor Cyrus, was dead, their contract was void. The war between them was over. Then came the offer. Tissaphernes proposed a truce, an armistice. The great king, in his mercy, was prepared to grant the Greeks safe passage out of his empire. He did not wish for further bloodshed. All he asked was that the Greeks formally surrender themselves to his authority and hand over their arms. In return, he would provide them with guides and a market where they could purchase provisions for their long journey home. He spoke of a peaceful, orderly withdrawal back to the shores of the Aegean Sea. The offer was tantalizing. It was a lifeline, a sudden, unexpected path out of a seemingly hopeless situation. The thought of a peaceful journey home, of seeing their families and their cities again was a powerful lure. For the common soldier, exhausted and demoralized, it sounded like salvation. But for Clearchus and the other senior commanders, the offer was riddled with warning signs. To hand over their arms was unthinkable. Their weapons were their only true guarantee of safety. Without their spears and shields, they would be nothing more than a column of helpless prisoners, entirely at the mercy of a king they had just tried to depose. The memory of Persian treachery was long and well documented. In the Greek world, they knew the reputation of men like Tissaphernes, whose name was a byword for cunning and deceit. Clearchus, his face like carved stone, negotiated with a blunt soldierly caution. He refused to surrender their arms, stating that their weapons were essential for their survival, even against the wild tribes they might encounter on their way home. He questioned Tissaphernes relentlessly, probing for weaknesses in his proposal. The Persian satrap remained impeccably polite, smoothly deflecting every concern. He swore solemn oaths by the Persian gods that no harm would come to them. He proposed that the Greek generals meet him again in a few days in his own camp to finalize the details of the withdrawal and to cement their new, peaceful relationship. It would be a feast of friendship, a formal parley to seal the truce. Despite their deep misgivings, the Greeks had little choice but to agree. The truce was their only hope, and they clung to it, even as the cold voice of instinct warned them that they were walking into a beautifully constructed trap. A few days later. Under the fragile banner of the new truce, the Greek high command prepared to attend the parley in the Persian camp. An air of deep unease hung over the proceedings. The decision to go was not made lightly. Many of the junior officers and veteran soldiers argued vehemently against it, their instincts screaming that it was a trap. To walk willingly into the heart of the enemy's lair felt like an act of collective suicide. The promises of a man like Tissaphernes, they argued, were written on the wind. But Clearchus, the Spartan general, overruled them. His logic was grim and pragmatic. He believed that to show open distrust would be to shatter the truce himself, provoking the very attack they sought to avoid. He felt they had to display a degree of faith, however forced, to keep the path home open. He staked his life, and the lives of his fellow generals, on the faint hope that the Persian offer was genuine. And so, they went. Clearchus, along with 4 other senior generals and a score of company-grade captains, dressed in their finest armor, as if for a formal ceremony. They left their army behind, instructing them to wait and remain vigilant. They crossed the open ground that separated the two camps, a small, brave, and terribly vulnerable procession. As they approached the opulent command tent of Tissaphernes, they could see the immense scale of the Persian host up close for the first time. It was a city of tents, a sprawling, intimidating world of imperial power. They were greeted with awe. The elaborate courtesy of the Persian court. Tissaphernes welcomed them with smiles and gracious words. They were ushered into his lavish tent, a space filled with rich carpets, ornate furniture, and the scent of exotic incense. Wine was offered. Servants bustled about. The atmosphere was one of relaxed, disarming friendship. For a brief, fleeting moment, it was possible to believe that the truce was real, that the danger had passed. The discussion began, centered on the logistics of the Greeks' departure. Tissaphernes was charming, agreeable, and utterly convincing. He spoke of routes, of supplies, of the guides he would provide. He worked to soothe every last suspicion, to put the Greek commanders completely at their ease. The captains, the junior officers who had accompanied the generals, were asked to wait outside the main tent while the final sensitive details were hammered out by the senior leadership, and then, the trap was sprung. At a single, pre-arranged signal from Tissaphernes, perhaps a nod of the head, a subtle gesture of the hand, the atmosphere inside the tent changed in a heartbeat. The smiling servants vanished, replaced by heavily armed Persian guards, who seemed to materialize from the very walls of the tent. Before the Greek generals could even react, before they could reach for the swords at their sides, they were overwhelmed. Clearchus and the others were seized, disarmed, and violently subdued. Simultaneously, Outside the tent, the waiting Greek captains were surrounded by a sudden, overwhelming force of Persian cavalry. There was no fight, no chance to resist. They were simply engulfed, cut down where they stood in a brief, merciless slaughter. From their own camp, a mile away, the soldiers of the 10,000 watched the unfolding horror. They could not see the details, but they saw the sudden, violent surge of the Persian cavalry. They heard the distant, truncated screams. They saw the riderless horses of their captains bolting in panic across the plain. And then they saw that, most damning sight of all, a contingent of Persian horsemen riding towards them, and held aloft on the points of their spears were the severed bloody heads of the slain captains. The message was unambiguous, a visceral, brutal declaration. The truce was a lie. The parley was a massacre. Their leaders were gone. The betrayal was absolute. Asterisk, asterisk, the sight of their captains' severed heads, paraded with such contemptuous cruelty by the Persian cavalry, struck the Greek camp like a physical blow. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the ranks, followed by a stunned, deathly silence. The last, fragile sliver of hope that the truce had been real, that a peaceful way home existed, was brutally extinguished. The betrayal was not just tactical, it was profound, a violation of the most sacred oaths sworn before the gods. It was a clear and terrifying statement from the great king. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no escape, as the Persian horsemen wheeled away, leaving the grim reality to sink in. The silence in the Greek camp curdled into a new and terrible emotion, despair. It descended upon the army, not with a crash, but like a slow, suffocating fog. The men stood frozen, staring at the spot where their leaders had been murdered, their minds struggling to process the sheer scale of the catastrophe. In a single stroke, they had been decapitated. Their entire command structure, the 5 senior generals who held the ultimate authority, and the 20 captains who formed the vital link between strategy and the common soldier, was gone. Clearchus, the iron-willed Spartan who had been their anchor, was captured, destined for a slow, humiliating death in a Persian dungeon. The others were butchered. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly shore, stranded deep within the heart of one of the most powerful empires on earth. They were surrounded by an enemy that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, an enemy that had just proven it would not be bound by any rule of honor or civilized warfare. They had no leaders to give them orders, no strategy to guide their actions, no one to tell them what to do next. They were simply a collection of 10,000 individuals, a mob of terrified men, waiting for the inevitable final assault. As dusk began to fall, casting long, ominous shadows across the plain, the despair deepened into a palpable physical presence. The usual camp routine ceased. No fires were lit. The thought of cooking or eating was impossible. The cheerful or argumentative chatter that normally filled the evening air was replaced by an oppressive quiet. Men sat by their unlit campfires, staring blankly into the growing darkness, their heads in their hands. Others lay on the ground, wrapped in their cloaks, pulling them over their faces as if to shut out the horrifying reality of their situation. They did not sleep. They simply lay there, consumed by a black and hopeless apathy. This was the lowest point, the nadir of their existence. The fear was no longer the sharp adrenalized fear of battle, but a slow, cold, creeping dread that hollowed a man out from the inside. They thought of their homes, their families, the sun-drenched hills of Greece, and it all seemed like a dream from another life, a world they would never see again. They saw themselves as already dead, their fates sealed. They were a ghost army, haunting the place of their own demise. The Persians didn't even need to attack. The Greeks were being consumed from within, eaten alive by a despair so absolute, so profound, that it felt like the end of the world. The night that fell upon the camp was the darkest they had ever known, a shroud for an army that had lost its head, its hope, and its soul. The night was a black ocean of despair. The army lay in a state of collective paralysis, each man alone, with his own private terror. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft weeping of a soldier thinking of the home he would never see, or the restless shuffle of a man unable to find peace. The Persian camp, in stark contrast, was a blaze of light and triumphant noise. The sounds of their celebration carrying faintly on the night wind a cruel mockery of the Greeks' silent vigil of dread. To the Persians, the war was over. The mercenary army, leaderless and broken, was a wounded animal waiting to be put out of its misery at dawn. But in the deepest, most hopeless hours of that night, in a quiet corner of the sprawling darkened camp, one man could not surrender to the apathy. His name was Xenophon. He was not a general, not even a professional soldier in the same vein as the hardened veterans around him. He was a gentleman from Athens, a student of the philosopher Socrates, a man of intellect and letters who had joined the expedition more out of a sense of adventure and a personal admiration for Cyrus than for the pay. He was a junior officer, an observer more than a commander, a man who, until this point, had remained largely in the background. Like everyone else, Xenophon was consumed by fear and misery. He lay on the hard ground, unable to sleep, his mind racing through the horrifying calculus of their situation. He thought of the betrayal, the loss of their leaders, the immense hostile army that surrounded them. He felt the same cold tendrils of despair coiling around his heart. But then, as he lay there, a different thought began to push through the fog of hopelessness. It was a thought born of his Socratic education, a habit of mind that questioned, that analyzed, that refused to accept a conclusion without examining the premise. He asked himself, why are we just lying here, waiting to die? Are we to do nothing? Are we to simply wait for the sun to rise, so that the Persians can come and cut our throats, or, worse, take us captive to be tortured and mutilated for the king's amusement? The thought of such a passive, ignominious end filled him with a sudden, burning indignation. It was an offense to his dignity, to his identity as a free Greek. To die fighting was one thing. To die like cattle in a pen was another. A fire was lit within him. It was not the fire of a seasoned general's strategic genius, but the fire of a citizen's refusal to be a victim. He forced himself to his feet, his own fear still a cold knot in his stomach, but now overlaid with a new, fierce resolve. He began to walk through the darkened camp, moving from one silent, miserable group of soldiers to the next. He sought out the remaining junior officers, the captains and lieutenants, who were now the army's most senior leadership. He found them in the same state of despair as everyone else. He went to them, his voice low but urgent in the darkness. He did not offer them false hope or easy answers. He simply shared the questions that had ignited his own spirit. What are we waiting for, he asked them, for the enemy to decide our fate? We still have our arms. We still have our strength. We are 10,000 strong. Are we to make no use of this strength? Are we to die shamefully, when we could die with honor, or better yet, live with honor? His words were like sparks landing on dry tinder. He spoke of their shared Hellenic heritage, of their ancestors who had faced down the Persian hordes at Marathon and Salamis. He reminded them that they were not just mercenaries, they were Greeks. And Greeks did not surrender their freedom without a fight. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to rekindle the dying embers of their courage. He was not giving orders, he was awakening a spirit. In the heart of that desperate night, a philosopher, an amateur soldier, was refusing to let the story end here. He was reminding them that even in the face of certain death, there is one choice that can never be taken away, the choice to act. And with that simple, powerful idea, he began to pull the army back from the abyss. Xenophon's words, spoken with such desperate conviction in the dead of night, had broken the spell of despair. He had not offered them a plan, but something far more important, a reason to have a plan. As dawn approached, the assembly he had called began to gather. It was not a formal military muster, but a spontaneous convergence of men who had chosen hope over apathy. They came from all corners of the camp, their faces still etched with fear and exhaustion, but in their eyes there was a new light, a flicker of defiance. Standing before this ragged assembly of survivors, Xenophon and the other junior officers, who had joined him, laid out the stark reality of their choice. They could stay and die, or they could march and perhaps die, but on their own terms, fighting for a chance, however slim, to live. The choice, when put so plainly, was no choice at all. A murmur of assent grew into a roar of agreement. The paralysis was broken. They would march, but how? And who would lead them? Their entire command structure had been annihilated. They were an army without a head. It was here that the Greeks fell back on the most fundamental principle of their civilization. The very idea that separated them from the Persian Empire they now fought. Democracy. They were not the subjects of a king. They were free citizens, and if they had no leaders, they would elect new ones. Right there, on that foreign field, thousands of miles from home, the army transformed itself. It ceased to be a mercenary company, bound by a contract to a dead prince. It became a polis, a moving city-state, a walking democracy. The soldiers themselves, the men of the rank and file, raised their spears to vote, their voices shouting out the names of the men they now trusted with their lives. They chose leaders not based on prior rank or noble birth, but on the qualities they needed most in this desperate hour: courage, intelligence, and resolve. A grizzled Boeotian officer named Proxenus, known for his steady hand, was chosen. A tough, pragmatic Achaean named Cleena was elected. And Xenophon himself, the Athenian intellectual whose words had pulled them back from the brink, was acclaimed. As one of the new generals, he had not sought command, but it had been thrust upon him by the will of the men he had inspired. This act of democratic election was a profound transformation. It fundamentally changed the character of the army. The soldiers were no longer just following orders. They were following men they had personally chosen, men in whom they had placed their own sovereign trust. This created a new and powerful bond of loyalty and shared responsibility. Every soldier was now a citizen of this mobile republic, a stakeholder. In its survival, the new generals immediately set about reorganizing the army for the ordeal to come. They established a clear chain of command. They appointed new captains to replace the ones who had been murdered. They held a council of war, not in a secret tent, but in the open, among the soldiers, debating the best route and strategy. The decision was made. They would not try to retrace their steps south. That was the path of their betrayal. Instead, they would march north, towards the distant half-mythical shores of the Black Sea. It was a desperate gamble, a journey into the unknown, through hostile mountains and savage tribes, but it was their decision, made freely. The army had been broken, betrayed, and left for dead, but from its own ashes, it had been reborn, forged anew in the fires of democracy and desperation. It was no longer the army of Cyrus. It was the army of the 10,000. With the first light of dawn, a grim and purposeful energy replaced the despair of the previous day. The Greeks made a great pyre in the center of their camp. Into it, they threw everything they could not carry, everything that might slow them. Down tents, excess baggage, fine carpets, and ornate furniture looted from the battlefield. All of it was committed to the flames. It was a ritual of purification, a severing of their past. They were stripping themselves down to the bare essentials of survival: their weapons, their armor, and the dwindling supply of food they could carry on their backs. The rising column of black smoke was a signal to the watching Persians, a declaration of intent. We are not surrendering. We are not waiting for you. We are leaving. The newly elected generals, with Xenophon at the forefront of the planning, organized the army for the march. They could not march in a simple column. That would leave them too vulnerable to the swarming Persian cavalry. Instead, they devised a new formation, a large, hollow square. The remaining baggage animals and the non-combatants were placed in the protected center. The hoplites formed the four sides of the square, a moving fortress of shields and spears. The front, or vanguard, would clear the path. The rear guard, the most dangerous and critical position, would have to fend off the inevitable pursuit. The flanks would protect them from being encircled. It was a slow, cumbersome, but defensible formation. a snail shell of bronze and iron inching its way across the hostile landscape. The order was given. The great square, over 10,000 strong, began to move. It was a slow, deliberate, and defiant act. They turned their backs on Babylon, on the scene of their betrayal, and set their faces to the north. Their destination was a vague and distant hope, the Euxine Sea, the Greek name for the Black Sea. It was a name whispered like a prayer. The Black Sea was their connection to the Hellenic world. Its shores were dotted with Greek colonies, cities, like Sinope and Trapezus. If they could reach the sea, they could find ships. If they could find ships, they could get home. But between them and that distant shore lay a vast uncharted territory. Their maps were useless here. They were marching into the unknown, guided only by the sun and the stars. They knew the path north would lead them away from the flat plains and into the rugged, mountainous lands of the Cardaceans, the wild, untamed region of modern Kurdistan. They knew this land was inhabited by fierce, independent tribes who had never been conquered by the Persian Empire. They were choosing to march not away from danger, but into a different, perhaps even greater, kind of danger. The decision was a desperate gamble, born of necessity. To return south, the way they had come, was to march through lands controlled by Tissaphernes, the architect of their betrayal. It was to invite constant, organized harassment from the main Persian army. The northern route, while perilous and unknown, offered a sliver of hope. The terrain would be difficult for the Persian cavalry, their primary threat, and the mountain tribes, while hostile, were not the unified army of the great king. It was a choice between a near-certain death and a slim chance of survival. And so the long march began. Every step was an act of faith and defiance. They were a walking city, a democratic army, moving through a world that wanted them dead. Their goal was no longer gold or glory, but the simple, elemental human desire to see home again. The Anabaptista going up was over. Now began the Catabesist, the going down, the long, brutal, and epic journey home. The Greeks had hoped that by marching north into more rugged terrain, they might escape the relentless attention of the main Persian army. This hope was shattered almost immediately. Tissaphernes, enraged and humiliated by the sight of his trapped prey simply walking away, was not about to let them go. He could not commit the bulk of his heavy infantry to a long pursuit, but he had something far better suited for the task. His cavalry, tens of thousands of them, and with them, a new and terrifying threat. The elite Persian slingers and archers. The hunt began. As the Greek square crawled northward, the Persian cavalry materialized, a persistent, tormenting presence. They did not dare to charge the solid walls of the phalanx. A horse and rider, no matter how brave, stood no chance against a hedge of lowered spears. So they employed a different, more insidious tactic. A tactic of attrition, of harassment, of death by 1,000 cuts. They became a storm cloud that hung perpetually over the Greek rearguard. The Persian horsemen would gallop to within a few hundred yards of the marching square, just outside the effective range of a thrown javelin. Then, the archers among them would rein in their horses and let fly a volley of arrows. The sky would darken for a moment as hundreds of shafts arced through the air, their bodkin points designed to pierce linen and leather armor. The arrows rained down on the men in the rear ranks, a deadly, indiscriminate hail. A man would be marching, shield held high, and suddenly a searing pain would tear through his shoulder, his leg, or, if he was unlucky, his neck. The slingers were, in some ways, even more terrifying. These were specialists, men who had spent their lives mastering a simple but lethal weapon. They would whirl their slings, a blur of motion, and release lead or stone projectiles at incredible velocity. These missiles didn't have the range of an arrow, but they were brutally effective. They flew too fast to be seen, and they struck with the force of a hammer blow. A lead slug could shatter a bronze helmet, break a bone, or kill a man instantly, with a sickening, percussive crack. This was a new kind of warfare for the Greeks. They were hoplites, masters of the close quarters, decisive shock battle. Their entire military doctrine was based on closing with the enemy and destroying him with spear and sword. But here, there was no enemy to close with. The enemy was a phantom, a ghost on horseback who struck from a distance and then danced away before any retaliation was possible. The Greeks could only endure. The men in the rear guard would raise their shields, forming a testudo or tortoiseshell of bronze, and huddle together as the deadly rain fell upon them. They would hear the thud of arrows embedding in their shields, the sharp crack of slingstones striking helmets, and the agonized cries of their comrades who were hit. The harassment was relentless, a form of psychological torture as much as a physical assault. It went on from dawn until dusk, every single day. The march became a slow, agonizing crawl through a storm of missiles. The rearguard, which took the brunt of the attacks, became a place of honor and of certain death. Men were constantly being wounded, their comrades having to drag them into the relative safety of the square's center. The number of injured grew daily, slowing the army's progress even further. The Persians were bleeding them, weakening them, trying to break their spirit with 1,000 pinpricks. The Greeks were a wounded beast, and the jackals were circling, waiting for them to collapse. The relentless, one-sided punishment at the hands of the Persian missile cavalry could not be sustained. Morale was plummeting. The number of wounded was becoming a crisis, slowing the entire army to a crawl. The men were brave, but bravery was no defense against an enemy you could not reach. The new generals, Xenophon, chief among them, realized that to simply endure was a losing strategy. It was a slow-motion annihilation. If they were to survive, they could not just react, they had to innovate. They had to learn to fight a new kind of war, on the march, in real time. During the brief, nervous halts at the end of each day, the Greek command became a mobile war college. Xenophon, the Athenian thinker, gathered the most experienced and clever officers. They analyzed the problem with a cold, desperate clarity. Their core strength, the hoplite phalanx, was also their core weakness in this new context. It was a hammer in a fight that required a rapier. It was too slow, too ponderous. Its reach was too short. They needed their own long-range threat. They had to fight fire with fire. The first innovation was the creation of a dedicated counter-harassment force. Xenophon called for volunteers from the main body of the army. He needed men who were not just brave, but fast. He also needed men with the right skills. A careful survey of the army revealed a hidden asset, a contingent of about 200 soldiers from the island of Rhodes. In the Hellenic world, Rhodians were renowned as the masters of the sling. Their skill was legendary, far surpassing that of the Persians. They used larger, heavier lead slugs and possessed a technique that gave them superior range and accuracy. They had been tragically underutilized, but now, they were the army's most valuable weapon. A new unit was formed around the Rhodian slingers. They were supplemented by a small number of Cretan archers who were also among the ranks, men whose skill with the bow was famous throughout Greece. This new missile corps was a revelation. The next time the Persian cavalry approached to begin their deadly harassment, they were met with a stunning surprise. As they came into what they thought was their safe range, a devastatingly accurate volley of lead slugs and arrows erupted from the Greek lines. The Rhodian slings, in particular, outranged the Persian bows. Lead slugs smashed into riders and horses with brutal force, knocking them from their saddles. The Persian horsemen, accustomed to attacking with impunity, were shocked. They pulled back in confusion, having suffered casualties for the first time. The second innovation addressed the problem of speed. Xenophon and his colleagues established a small, agile cavalry force of their own, numbering perhaps 50 horsemen, mounted on the best of the remaining baggage horses. It was a tiny, pathetic unit compared to the thousands of Persian riders, but its purpose was strategic. When the Persian skirmishers got too close, this small Greek cavalry unit would launch a sudden, lightning-fast charge from the protection of the square. They couldn't win a prolonged fight, but they could, sow chaos, disrupt the enemy's attack, and give the Greek slingers and archers time to do their work before retreating back to the safety of the phalanx. These new tactics born of desperation and ingenuity, fundamentally changed the dynamic of the march. The Greeks were no longer just a passive target. They were fighting back. The hollow square was no longer just a defensive shell. It was now a mobile fortress, a platform from which they could project their own power. The daily march was still a grueling ordeal, but it was no longer a one-sided slaughter. It had become a running tactical battle, a deadly game of chess played out across the plains of Mesopotamia. The Greeks had adapted. They had learned. They had proven that their greatest weapon was not the spear or the shield, but the resilient, creative, and indomitable mind of the free soldier. After weeks of the grueling running battle across the plains, the landscape began to change. The flat open country that had been the domain of the Persian cavalry started to ripple and fold, rising into rugged foothills. The army had reached the edge of the great king's effective control. They were entering the wild, untamed lands of the Carduchians, the fierce tribal peoples who inhabited the mountains of what is now Kurdistan. The Greeks watched as the last of Tissaphernes's cavalry, their horses, ill-suited to the steepening terrain, finally gave up the chase. The spectral horsemen who had haunted them for so long vanished from their rear. A collective sigh of relief went through the army. The constant nerve-shredding harassment was over, but their relief was tragically short-lived. They had not escaped danger. They had merely traded one hell for another. The open desert, for all its terror, had been a known quantity. The enemy had been visible, his tactics understandable. This new world they were entering was one of shadows, cliffs, and unseen threats. The Carduchian mountains rose before them like a jagged, impassable wall, a fortress of stone and ice. The paths were no longer roads, but treacherous goat tracks that clung to the sides of sheer precipices. The Carduchians themselves were a people forged by this brutal landscape. They were warriors of legendary ferocity, a people so fierce and independent that not even the might of the Persian Empire had ever been able to subdue them. They answered to no king but their own clan chiefs. They viewed any armed force entering their territory not as an army to be negotiated with, but as an invasion to be destroyed. For the 10,000, they were a new and far more intimate kind of enemy. The hollow square formation, so effective on the plains, was now useless. The narrow, winding mountain passes forced the army to stretch out into a long, vulnerable column, miles from end to end. The hoplites, with their heavy shields and long spears, were clumsy and slow on the steep, rocky inclines. They were lowlanders, men of the plains and the sea, and they were utterly out of their element. The mountains were the Carduchians' home, their ally. They knew every cave, every ravine, every hidden path. The first attack came without warning. As the Greek column snaked its way through a narrow gorge, the silent cliffs above them suddenly came alive. Figures appeared on the ridges, men armed with powerful bows and slings. But this was not the long-range harassing fire of the Persians. This was a close-quarters, vertical ambush. A storm of arrows and stones rained down almost directly on top of them. Worse still, the Carduchians began to roll huge boulders down the mountainside. The massive rocks, weighing hundreds of pounds, crashed down into the packed column of men with terrifying force, smashing bodies and shields, creating chaos and panic. The Greeks were helpless. They could not charge up the sheer cliffs to engage the enemy. They could not form a shield wall on the narrow, uneven path. They could only press forward, heads down, shields held above them, as their comrades were crushed or shot down around them. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, ghosts in the rocks who struck with lethal force and then vanished. The open psychological terror of the plains had been replaced by a claustrophobic, intimate horror. Every blind corner, every high ridge, now held the promise of a sudden, brutal death. They had escaped the frying pan of the Persian plains, only to be thrown into the fire of the Kurdish mountains. The passage through the land of the Carduchians became a week-long nightmare. A continuous, rolling battle for survival in a vertical world. Each day brought a new and more terrifying form of ambush, a new test of their courage and resolve. The Greeks quickly learned that the greatest dangers lay in the narrow passes and defiles that choked the mountain range. These were the natural kill zones, and the Carduchian warriors were masters of using them. The vanguard of the Greek column would enter a pass, the rock walls rising steeply on either side, creating a sense of claustrophobic dread. The air would be still. The only sound the crunch of their own sandals on the gravel path and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the men. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with violence. The men would scan the ridges above, their eyes straining to see any sign of movement, their hands gripping their spears so tightly their knuckles turned white. Then, the ambush would be sprung. It often began with a single chilling war cry, echoing down from the heights. The cry would be answered by hundreds of others, and suddenly, the cliffs would erupt with enemies. The Carduchians seemed to swarm out of the very rock itself. They were incredibly agile, moving with a goat-like surety over the treacherous terrain. They would appear on ledges and outcrops that seemed impossible to reach, firing their powerful bows with deadly accuracy. The Greeks were caught in a deadly crossfire. Arrows would rain down from both sides of the pass, striking men from their blind spots. The heavy hoplite shield, the aspis, was designed for frontal assault. It offered little protection from an arrow coming from a high angle or from the side. Men would fall, clutching at shafts that had found a gap in their armor, their cries of pain echoing horribly in the enclosed space. But the arrows were only part of the horror. The Carduchians' most devastating tactic was their use of gravity as a weapon. From their high perches, they would heave or roll massive rocks down upon the column. These were not small stones. They were boulders, some as large as a cartwheel. They would bound down the steep slopes, gathering momentum, crashing through the ranks with unstoppable force. A single boulder could kill several men, smashing through shields, helmets, and bodies with sickening, crunching impacts. The sound of it was terrifying, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar, and there was nothing to do but pray it did not hit you. To be caught in one of these ambushes was to experience a feeling of utter helplessness. The Greeks were warriors, but their form of warfare was useless here. They could not form a phalanx. They could not charge the enemy. They were reduced to targets in a shooting gallery. Their only option was to run the gauntlet, to push forward through the kill zone as fast as they could, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, desperate to reach the relative safety of the open ground beyond the pass. Each ambush left the army weaker, more battered, with fewer men, and lower morale. The mountains were bleeding them, one pass at a time, and the journey through this vertical hell had only just begun. After 7 days of brutal, relentless fighting, the battered Greek army finally descended from the high passes of the Carduchian mountains. They left behind hundreds of their dead, their bodies lying unburied in the ravines and gorges where they had fallen. The survivors were scarred, exhausted, and traumatized. They had entered the mountains as a confident fighting force, and had emerged as a ragged band of survivors. But, as they reached the lower elevations and crossed the Centrites River, leaving the lands of the Carduchians behind them, they believed the worst was over. They had faced the great king's army and the fiercest tribes in Asia, and had survived. Now, they were entering the satrapy of Armenia, a land nominally under Persian control, but one they hoped would be less hostile. Their hope for respite was cruelly, immediately, and utterly shattered. As they marched into the high plains of Armenia, a new enemy appeared, one more implacable and more terrifying than any human foe they had yet faced. It was an enemy they could not fight, could not reason with, and could not escape. Winter, it began subtly, with a change in the air. A sharp, biting edge to the wind that cut through their worn linen tunics. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turned to a uniform, oppressive gray. Then, the first flakes of snow began to fall. For these men, born and raised in the mild, sun-drenched climate of the Mediterranean, it was a strange and unsettling sight. Many had never seen snow before. At first, it was a novelty, a soft white dust that melted as soon as it touched the ground. The blizzard raged for days, and when it finally subsided, it left behind a world transformed into an Arctic wasteland. The sun was a weak, distant disk in a pale sky, offering no warmth, its light only serving to create a painful, blinding glare off the endless fields of snow. For the 10,000, the end of the storm was not a reprieve, but the beginning of a new, slower, and more agonizing form of suffering. Two new enemies now stalked the ranks, as deadly as any human foe: starvation and frostbite. The snow was waist-deep in most places, and in the drifts, it was often over a man's head. Every step was a monumental effort, a struggle against the thick, clinging powder that sapped the strength from their already exhausted limbs. The army could no longer march, it could only wade a slow, desperate crawl through a frozen ocean. Their food supplies, already meager, were now almost completely gone. The land offered nothing. It was a frozen desert, its bounty locked away beneath a thick sheet of ice and snow. The baggage animals, their last source of emergency food, began to succumb to the cold and hunger, collapsing in the snow. Their frozen carcasses quickly buried by the relentless drifts. Hunger became a constant, gnawing presence, a hollow ache in the pit of every man's stomach that soon blossomed into a debilitating weakness. Men became gaunt, their faces hollowed out, their eyes sunken. Their thoughts, once occupied with tactics and survival, were now consumed by a single, primal obsession: food. A handful of scavenged frozen grain was a feast. The last strips of leather from their gear were chewed until their jaws ached, offering no nourishment, only a fleeting distraction from the emptiness. But it was the cold, the relentless, seeping cold, that was the most insidious executioner. The Greeks' equipment was a tragic joke in this environment. Their bronze helmets and greaves became conduits of frost, sucking the warmth from their heads and shins. Their single linen tunics and worn cloaks were useless against the sub-zero temperatures. The most immediate and brutal consequence was frostbite. Their feet were the first to go. The wet leather sandals froze solid, encasing their feet in blocks of ice. The men's toes would first grow numb, a blessed relief from the aching cold, but this numbness was the first sign of death. The flesh would turn waxy and white, then blacken as the tissue died. Men would stumble into the makeshift camps at night, and, upon removing their frozen footwear, find that their toes had simply broken off, left behind in the frozen leather. The suffering was unimaginable. Soldiers would wrap their feet in scraps of animal hide, anything to create a barrier against the snow, but it was a futile gesture. Their faces, exposed to the biting wind, became blackened and cracked, the skin peeling away. Their fingers, clumsy with cold, could barely grip their spears. A new, terrifying affliction appeared: snow blindness. The constant, unrelenting glare from the snow burned their eyes, causing excruciating pain and temporary, sometimes permanent, blindness. Men would stumble along, sightless, clinging to the shoulder of the man in front of them, their world reduced to a universe of white pain. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. The will to live, which had burned so brightly, began to flicker and die. Men would simply give up. A soldier, overwhelmed by exhaustion and despair, would sit down in the snow, refusing to go any further. His comrades would plead with him, try to drag him, but his spirit was broken. He would just sit there, motionless, as the snow slowly covered him, a willing victim of the cold's gentle, lethal embrace. The army was leaving a trail of frozen statues in its wake, monuments to a despair as deep and as white as the snow that surrounded them. The march through the frozen hell of Armenia had devolved into a primal, day-to-day struggle for existence. The grand strategic objective, the Black Sea, had become an abstract concept, a half-forgotten myth. The only objective now was to survive until the next sunrise. Yet, even in this state of near-total collapse, they were not granted the peace of a slow frozen death. The human predators of this land were still a threat. Though the main Persian army was long gone, the high plains of Armenia were not entirely empty. They were dotted with the territories of local tribes and the garrisons of Persian satraps who ruled the region. These local forces, unlike Tissaphernes's grand army, were well acclimated to the brutal conditions. They knew how to fight in the snow. They would appear as if from nowhere, often on skis or snowshoes, moving with a swift, spectral grace across the frozen landscape that so hobbled the Greeks. The attacks were not pitched battles, but opportunistic, predatory strikes. A local chieftain, leading a band of warriors, would watch the slow, agonizing crawl of the Greek column from a distant, snow-covered ridge. They would see a group of foragers, driven by desperate hunger to wander from the main body in search of a hidden village or a frozen cache of grain. The tribesmen would descend upon them like wolves, their attack swift and merciless, their victims too weak and cold to offer any meaningful resistance. The Greeks learned quickly that to stray from the column was a death sentence. Even the main body was not safe. The local garrisons, loyal to the Persian satrap, Tiribazus, would use their cavalry to harass the column. These were not the light skirmishers of the plains. These were heavy lancers, their horses specially shod for the snow. They would charge out of the swirling snow, strike at the vulnerable flanks of the column, and then retreat before the exhausted hoplites could form a proper defense. Each of these small, brutal encounters was a new trauma, a new drain on the army's dwindling strength and morale. But they also served a grim purpose. They forced the Greeks to keep fighting, to keep moving. The threat of a sudden violent death was the only thing more powerful than the seductive, peaceful call of freezing to death in the snow. The leadership of Xenophon and the other elected generals was tested to its absolute limit. Their role was no longer just military, it was psychological. They moved up and down the long straggling line of men, their own faces blackened by frostbite, their voices hoarse. They cajoled, they threatened, they pleaded. They would physically lift men who had fallen, forcing them back to their feet. They organized raiding parties to attack fortified villages, not for glory, but for the life-saving grain stored within. These village assaults were desperate, brutal affairs. The Greeks, driven by a hunger that bordered on madness, would storm wooden palisades, fighting with a savage intensity that shocked the defenders. Success meant a brief reprieve, a full belly, a roof over their heads for a night, a fire to thaw their frozen limbs. Failure meant more men lost for nothing. They fought their way across Armenia. One frozen river, one snow-choked pass, one hostile village at a time. They were no longer a proud army, but a ragged pack of starving, freezing men, driven by the most basic animal instinct to survive. They were fighting a war on two fronts, against the hostile people of the land, and against the land itself. And it was impossible to know which enemy was the more relentless.